Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar organized by the European Network on Independent Living on the topic of assisted dying, voices from the disability community. I'm very pleased all of you have joined. And I will start by doing some housekeeping. But first of all, my name is Ines Bulic Kojokariu. I'm the director of ENIL, and I will be moderating this webinar. So just to start with, I would like to inform you that we have captioning during this webinar, closed captioning. So if you would like to use captions, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and you can enable captions. Also, I will just now post in the chat. We have a link that you can copy paste into your browser if you would prefer to follow captions that way. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please use the chat box. You can make comments during the webinar or during the Q&A part. We will monitor them and get to them. The last 15 minutes, we should have time for questions and answers. So at that point, feel free to also raise your hand and ask a question or make a comment. And of course, you can use the reaction buttons as you wish. Some accessibility tips. Please, when you are speaking, just say your name, and in case you're affiliated with an organization, let us know which one. Keep your point as short, as clear as you can. Use plain language, no jargon. Be respectful of each other's time. Please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking, so there is no background noise. And if you can, please switch on your camera when speaking. So these were some housekeeping things. Now to get started. Well, I'm very pleased that we were able to organize this webinar on the topic of assisted dying. Just as a matter of background, it's a topic I think that everyone has some kind of an opinion on, whether they are very much for assisted dying or against. Even within ENIL and the disability community, I think there's all sorts of opinions. And as ENIL, as the European Network on Independent Living, we have been approached in the past with the question of what does the independent living movement think about assisted dying? Where do we stand on this topic? So in order to respond to that, it took us some time, but with the help of our colleague here, Antonella, we have gathered different opinions from our members of the movement, and we have produced a sort of discussion paper on assisted dying, which we will be presenting today. In addition to Antonella, who will be presenting this paper, we also have the pleasure of having with us two, I think, really excellent speakers. First one is Dr. Miro Griffiths. Miro is, well, I think a very well-known disability studies scholar. He's based at the University of Leeds. He's an activist. He's also closely affiliated with ENIL and was one of the founders of our youth network. So Miro will give us a bit of an introduction into the topic of assisted dying, just to set it out and to explain sort of the human rights implications. Then we will hear from Peter Torres-Fremlin. Peter is the author of also quite well-known Disability Debrief, a very useful newsletter where he recently covered this topic and gave a bit of an overview of what is happening in different countries. So Peter is going to tell us a little bit about that. And then Antonella will present Ina's position. Without further ado, let's get started. We have 1 hour. And as I said, we should have time for questions at the end. So now I will stop sharing this presentation. And I will hand over to Miro for the introduction. So Miro, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Pleasure to be with you all. Thank you for inviting me. It's great also to see Peter here. And Disability Debrief, I think, is an excellent resource and one that I use a lot. So it's great to see Peter engaging on this topic as well. So my role really is just to kind of cover some key arguments and observations and tensions within thinking about assisted dying in relation to disability politics and disabled people's pursuit for liberation and thinking about that in the context of human rights. And I will say that as somebody who speaks quite publicly on this topic, and is very open in being staunchly opposed to assisted dying. Obviously, that will highlight in some of the things I talk about and the way in which I've framed many of the things I'm talking about. But even if you are somebody who supports this subject matter, thinking about the tensions and implications is a useful way also to help defend and justify positions for and against. Um, so with that, I'll try and talk through some key points. I will say as well, sometimes I'll flip into talking about assisted dying or assisted suicide. Much of my work uses the term suicide. But again, I'm conscious that people will use different terminologies for this. So the core message is really when you look at the writings around disability and assisted dying, this comes down to a debate about what we mean around individual choice. And it is about a debate which is where choices are understood and thought about in relation to people's living conditions and circumstances. And of course, when we think about disabled people's lives, we're thinking about living in society which is unequal, living in conditions of inequality and of struggle. And therefore, these experiences in daily life will play into people's thinking about either a fear or a desire for assisted dying. And of course, on the one hand, we also have to recognize that in the work around disabled people's rights and disabled people's pursuit for liberation, disabled people do talk about impairment effects. So we do talk about pain, we do talk about how our health may be changing, our needs are changing, our health may be declining, or we may have progressive conditions that change the types of support that we need. But the question really is whether the state, because often assisted suicide sits within either the state operating the mechanisms or allowing for private organizations to facilitate this. The question is whether the state has a duty to make life livable, supported, and equal. And when that duty is unmet, and often it is unmet when we think about disabled people's lives, the question is whether assisted dying reflects and deepens then the injustices rather than trying to mitigate some of the concerns that disabled people have in the way in which their lives are being led and the struggles that they're encountering. And a useful place to start really is also to think through how the UNCRPD, so the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, how it positions thinking about equality and freedom and choice to live a fulfilled and flourishing life. And we know that many of the articles talk about, such as Article 10, talks about a right to life and an equal basis with others. And if you look at many of the writings from the UN rapporteurs and from the guidance notes and groups that are engaged with thinking about the interpretation of the UN, there has been questions raised about how disability is often situated as a ground or justification for ending somebody's life. So there's also questions about how, if the state is allowing the terms of operating assisted dying to be justified on the basis of disability or diagnosis or impairment, then the question is whether this reinforces the assumptions that having an impairment means that you have a prevalence or a possible desire in terms of individual or society to think that life is too difficult to live. And the question then is, of course, is then does the state then have a position of thinking, well, we have to facilitate the option of assisted suicide, whilst at the same time recognizing that we are struggling to ensure that disabled people have rights and sufficient support, and that there is social transformation to end things like institutionalization, provide accessible housing, provide participation in society. And these are all things that disabled people want, but often do not have. And it is these issues, if we look at the data, these are the issues that people use as the justification for why they want their life to end. They talk about struggling with accessible housing. They talk about insufficient support and personal assistance mechanisms, inaccessibility in terms of accessing healthcare. So again, we need to respect individual choice, but we have to understand how individual choice is being influenced by how the social world and societies are being organized. So the question really is, and this is where you can see much of the tension within disability politics and human rights uh, discussions around assisted dying, is it really about choice, or is it about trying to understand how society is organized in a way which places then the pressure to think life is too difficult to live? So does the person choose, or is it really about what social world are we organizing, which has then produced this choice that people then want to pursue for in terms of death? So there's also, I think, if we look at some of the recognition of disabled people's life chances across Europe, the data is very clear. Almost half of disabled people have unmet medical needs in mainland Europe. That's compared to under 20% of people without impairments. We know that disabled people are overrepresented in poverty. We know that there is a lack of access to the labor market. So again, it's a question whether are we debating the idea that all disabled people have an equal opportunity to access a system that is being designed in a way where people who are choosing it are thinking that my life can't continue because of the struggles I'm having in daily life? And I'd also like to raise the recognition of that in much of the discussions around this, people will talk about individual choice. They'll talk about their own personal experiences as being the absolute key um, mechanism for determining whether this is something that should be pursued or not. And of course, we must recognize that every voice needs to be heard. And as in terms of disability politics, we talked quite importantly about disabled people having their voice heard, making sure that every disabled person's voice matters and counts. And that is important, whether we're for this or against this. But the key issue here is individual choice should never be used as a justification for then assuming that the state should enact policies that have widespread implications. So we can say that, the reason we may choose this for ourselves is due to our own impairment, the way in which we think about our body, the way in which we struggle with pain, and so on. But the answer, if one wants to push for assisted dying, is then to say, as a society, we are accepting a system, a mechanism that will then be open to everybody in some form, whether they meet a threshold or whether that threshold is expanded. And that brings me on to one of my other key points, which is that we have to recognize that sometimes in this debate, we talk about having assisted dying only open for a select group of people, and that usually then refers to certain conditions or impairment groups. But of course, the problem then is that we create an unequal system in the provision of the service, because then we get people who will say, well, this service is aligned with this impairment group or these circumstances, but aren't my circumstances equally valid? And this is where you get what's referred to as legislative creep or expansion criteria, where changes are made to the eligibility or the interpretation of who is permitted to access these services. And that system will then expand over time to include more and more people because the rationale is the individual's decision and choice to pursue this is the most important principle here. And again, I want to draw attention to the fact of we can have individual choices on this, but we're talking about a broader system of what does this mean for all communities living in society. And the question is whether the state should be facilitating, prioritizing, resourcing, distributing infrastructure that is designed to eradicate life, as opposed to support marginalized groups for their lives to flourish. So when we think about programs such as deinstitutionalization, when we think about independent living services, these are systems and priorities that we want, that we want to have resourced and embedded within society. And the question then for all of us really is does this sit in a compatible way with having the state provide resources, provide services, provide funding to having a system of assisted dying? And as I said, the thing I want to, I'll stop now, but the key question for all of us to think about is if you're passionate about assisted suicide or assisted dying because you believe it is the individual's choice to determine whether they want it or not, the question then from a disability politics and a human rights perspective is, does the fact that we live in an unequal society and that we are struggling against the injustices of having support taken away from us or not having support in the first place, does that influence our individual choice to determine whether our life is worth living? And that's why I think from a disability politics perspective, the question really is do we prioritize disabled people living thriving, flourishing, and accessible lives, or do we prioritize the individual choice to determine what they want to do when it comes to death? And what is the role of the state in that process? So thank you.
Thank you very much, Miro. These are some really important big questions. I'm happy to bring in Peter now. I'm just going to bring you forward here, Peter. Peter is going to tell us what he found out about how assisted dying, or as you say, assisted suicide, is approached in different countries around the world. And we might come back to you, Miro, in Q&A. So Peter, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ines. Thank you, Miro, for your really sort of brilliant overview of the questions in play. It's always really good to be here with Enil friends, although this one's a heavy subject that brings up very existential and frightening prospects for all of us. As kindly was introduced, I did Disability Debrief, which puts Disability Lens on World News. So just in general, I kind of curate disability news and have curated news on assisted dying from around the world. And then just recently, I published a piece by an academic researcher called Joe Wood, who gave a coverage of assisted dying in different countries and the different issues around autonomy and dignity and the questions it brings up and how it's structured in terms of eligibility and who does it. I really recommend the piece. Just put it in the chat. Doesn't take a position.
Sorry, Peter. Could you just speak up a little bit?
Hi, sorry. Is that better?
I think so. I'm just looking at the interpreter. I think it's better. Thank you.
My apologies. So yeah, I really encourage you to see Joe's piece as it kind of gets into the intricacies and it gets into a very technical question. And one of the reasons I commissioned it was to be able to take a step back and see how different countries are approaching it. In terms of what I would like to discuss is kind of look at how this subject relates to disabled people, both as sort of movements or as individuals. As Miro sort of said, one of the key issues is that then these systems are based on certain like eligibility criteria, like what groups are covered. So for instance, in the UK, the legislation being discussed was like people with terminally ill, less than 6 months to live. In other countries, you might have people with unbearable suffering, which is then a very different criteria. And these criteria matter a lot. But one thing that is in common across nearly all countries is that the rules of eligibility are based on health and disability, right? So whether we like it or not, this subject is very much about us and about public opinions of how disabled people are seen, and indeed that agency of disabled people, or the agency of people that are worrying they might become disabled. In a sort of like traditional sense, the political disability movement in many countries has been against assisted dying. And there are many really good reasons for this. I think Miro outlined very concretely these things. As Miro said, there's the question of the like a kind of slippery slope, that you start with a kind of quite restricted eligibility and then that widens. You have the context of sort of a wider society, and especially healthcare that might provide assisted dying being set against disabled people and us facing discrimination in every area of our lives, and the lack of supports and alternatives to live. How can you make a free choice if you don't have a genuine alternative? You then also have the question of how people may be pressured to make the choice by their family members, or by society, or by just an internalized ableism, shall we say, of like not wanting to be too much. So these concerns are often portrayed as like worries about what could happen, but when we look at Canada, we see a very real manifestation of them, right? And all of these warnings, if you forgive the expression, came to life. The Canada system has expanded dramatically over the past 10 years, so that now 4% of Canadians die by medically assisted, medical assistance in dying. So 4% of Canadians are killed by the government. There are a few really shocking things about the way this is done in Canada. First off, you can just go to hospital for some other concern, and then someone in hospital then says, well, did you think about assisted dying? Right? And people have reported this as they've been going into operation rooms. People have reported this from social care services. This is kind of completely inappropriate. I can imagine an argument saying, oh, well, people need to be aware of the choices that they have, right? But they're being made too aware of the choices they have, and this is like a horrible pressure to put people on real manifestation of this ableism of the doctor that like doesn't think maybe you should be alive, and they're suggesting, well, here's this other thing that you can do. The Canada is particularly worrying in the speed that you can get it, like sometimes even like a week or two of when you've applied, and real examples of cases that just people that needed like accessible housing, that just needed a basic support and weren't getting it, and they were doing assisted dying instead. So this is a real example manifest of all the concerns that Miro eloquently raised. And the kind of summary of this, from advocates in Canada and people living through this experience, is people are assisted to die but not to live. Yeah. So there isn't like any way we in a disability movement can agree with that. However, first, just concretely on this question of is there a slippery slope, right? There was in Canada, but there isn't necessarily everywhere. So, for instance, in California, they made assisted dying legal about the same time as they did in Canada 10 years ago, but now 15 times the number of Canadians die than Californians by assisted dying, with a population about the same size. So it's definitely not everywhere that slippery slope happens. That isn't necessarily an inevitable thing. And for me, perhaps the most important point is that around the world, it is disabled people requesting and campaigning for assisted dying. And I don't think that we as a movement, or as a sort of political factor in this, have taken those into account. Ina says the interpreter has frozen. Should I take a pause or?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, maybe let's wait 1 second to see what happens. He's paused and dramatic. Let's see. He's going to probably re-enter. So we can wait for him 1 second. He must have technical issues. Just watching just hold that thought. And there's a question that is for later, Peter, in the chat. Thank you for putting a message in the chat. There is a question, perhaps to address later. Is the Californian law similar to Canadians? I'm just watching the participants. If it takes too long, we will continue, I think, not to have captioning, which should help. I would say go on, Peter, and then hopefully Samuel will rejoin quickly. So we do have captions in the meantime.
Thank you, and my apologies for lack of the interpretation for the rest. So as I was saying, traditionally disability politics has been firmly against assisted dying, but when we look at countries around the world, it is disabled people themselves who are campaigning for access to assisted dying. That's Joe's article on the debrief covers this in countries around Europe, and you can see there for the details of campaigners that have been influential. And a striking case I also saw was from Peru, where Ana Estrada campaigned and then received assistance to die. I personally don't feel that the welcome back, Sam. I personally don't feel that the disability movement has always been respectful to that individual choice. In the UK, Liz Carr did, in many senses, a really brilliant documentary on assisted dying, but she didn't include in the documentary people that were terminally ill who wanted to die under the proposed legislation, right? And I think we have to apply nothing about us without us also when we don't agree with people and also to groups different from ourselves, as that was in the UK legislation, a very specific group of people being considered first. I think it is like there is this question, even with all of these social pressures, like what is the possibility for agency under that social pressures? A really beautiful comment that I got after publishing the piece was from Alex Ogonhoromo in Nigeria. He said he picked up on a point, someone saying like there's no such thing as an undignified life, it's undignified circumstances, and Alex picked up on undignified circumstances and he thought it was more complicated. He thought that there were dignified circumstances where the subject, for their own dignity, might just find it best to throw in the towel in his response. And I think on a personal basis, even though like I see all those structural things, and the more I find out and read and research, the more I find all those structural points are made true. I can also imagine circumstances where I might want to die and I might want the assistants to do it. I mean, I would certainly want the assistants to do it because I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it myself. There are kind of a couple of technical points that I would add. Miro's comments were very much about the role of the state. There are different ways of doing setting up assisted dying systems. So some are through the healthcare system, but say a system like Switzerland is done outside of the government system and is done by non-profit providers, but is regulated by the government legislation. So I think that's very different. Like it doesn't have to be done by the same system that is meant to be curing you. I think another really interesting nuance that came out of Joe Wood's article was a case from the Netherlands where someone had arranged and received permission to go ahead with an assisted death, and then when the final check came of do you still want this, she said no, actually I don't. And there is like a power to knowing you have that agency, a power to knowing that you can do this, and then to not do it. And in that case, the person following the newspaper article that reported on her was sort of living and getting supports and whatnot. As kind of is maybe coming out of what I'm saying, I kind of I think both arguments on both sides are very valid and I have a lot of sympathy with both. I'm relieved that I'm not trying to legislate it. But I would kind of leave you with a thought experiment, right? What would this discussion look like if assisted dying wasn't just for disabled people, wasn't just for sick people, right? What if we took like, it is, you also have a right to choose when you might die, and that would be, say, available for everyone, regardless of disability or health status. If we took the doctors out of this, right, would that be different? I don't know. For I think some people campaigning or pro-assisted dying, it would actually get to their preferences more, because some people are doing it on the basis of one should have the choice, and there are many reasons that why one might want this. Is it we've got our social concerns about death that mean that we want to tie it to disability rather than making it available to the general population? I think that's quite a complicated one to unpack. But I think it's kind of important to make these separations, because like this big part of the disability movement is arguing that like it's not, we can't assume that a disability makes our life worse. So yeah, I would just leave you there. Thank you again for having me in discussion. I really appreciate Enil's work to show different perspectives on this subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And I see there are some reactions in the chat. We can get to them later. But thank you for kind of giving us some idea of how this assisted dying works in different places and what are the implications. We'll get to the questions later. I will pass now the floor to Antonella. And Antonella will present what we've gathered from our membership and on this topic, on this issue, which then resulted in the position paper. So Antonella, you can share your screen if you like.
Thank you, Ines, and thank you also, Peter and Miro, for the previous intervention. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. Okay. Okay, so in this slide, I actually included the link to download the full position paper, but maybe Ines can also send in the chat. So why this position paper? Very briefly, as Ines already mentioned, this position paper was developed in response to the growing debates on assisted dying across Europe and more generally globally. As we say, the topic is complex and often polarizing. It raises ethical, legal, and social questions, but also very personal ones. And because of this, Enil wanted to ensure that the position reflect not just one perspective, but the diversity of views within the independent living movement. And at the same time, the paper is grounded in some core principles, such as self-determination, choice and control, and the institutionalization, to make sure that any discussion on assisted dying is approached from a human rights perspective, and it does not overlook the inequalities that disabled people face. What was the methodology? So to build this position, Enil carried out a consultation through online survey shared with the members. And participants were asked to provide several types of input. First, they described their legal situation in their country in terms of assisted dying. They share reflections on ethical, legal, medical, and personal aspects of the issue. And they were also invited to contribute testimonies in different formats, written, audio, or video form. And this allowed for more like personal insights. Very important to say also, respondents were asked what position Enil should take. And this helped to have also a concrete idea about this stance by the organization. Okay. Key part of this paper is the recognition of structural barriers to independent living across Europe. These include institutionalization, lack of personal assistance, inaccessible or unaffordable housing, barriers to healthcare, poverty, and discrimination. Together, these factors limit disabled people's ability to live independently and to make real choices about their lives. These barriers were central to the paper because they directly affect how decisions about assisted dying are made. If a person doesn't have access to basic support or is living in isolation or in poverty, their choices cannot be considered fully free. So in this context, assisted dying risk becoming more like a response to systemic failure rather than an expression of pure and genuine self-determination. So the paper emphasized that we cannot discuss assisted dying in isolation, but we must first look at the conditions in which disabled people are living. The results of the consultation show clear majority expressing opposition to assisted dying. So the graphic shows 44.1% of respondents were completely against it, and 14.7% were somewhat against it. And this brings the total opposition to nearly 59%. And at the same time, 14.7% supported a more neutral or balanced approach, recognizing the issue is indeed very complex. And on the other side, 14.7% were completely in favor, 8.8% somewhat in favor, and making around 23.5% expressing support to assisted dying. And finally, we also recognized we have 2.9% of participants saying they did not know what the position was. So these results highlight two things. First, that there is a clear majority concern, and second, that there is still a diversity of perspectives that need to be acknowledged. Several key human rights concerns emerged. First, the lack of support services. So many disabled people don't have access to personal assistance, healthcare, or community support. And in these situations, choosing assisted dying may reflect also a lack of alternatives rather than a real choice. Second, institutionalizations and gaps in support, including personal assistance. So when people are forced to live in institutions or lack support for basic daily activities, countries are failing their obligation under the CRPD. Also, another concern was about ableism and devaluation of disabled lives, as society often assumes that disability equals suffering, as we mentioned before, and this can influence both personal decisions and also medical judgments. And also, there are concerns about threats to independent living. Some people fear that legalizing assisted dying could reduce investment in support systems. There are some other main human rights concerns, the eugenic risk and historical precedents. Some people see assisted dying as the risk of encouraging death for disabled people, as they're often seen as less valuable, and especially during economic crisis. Also, safeguard failures, as many respondents express doubts that safeguards can fully prevent abuse or also bias. And finally, structural inequality. Without real alternatives and support, choices cannot be considered fully free. Despite the different opinions, there were also important points of agreement. First, shared commitment to self-determination and dignity. So even if people define these differently, they remain central values. Also, a strong consensus on the need for adequate support systems. Everyone during the consultation agreed that independent living must be properly implemented. There's a deep concern about ableism, especially in healthcare systems by doctors and medical staff, and also agreement on the need for indeed strong safeguards, transparency, and the involvement of disabled people in policy making. So this common ground is important because it's what provides a basis for future dialogue. Overall, the findings show that this is a complex issue with diverse perspective, but also clear structural concerns. Across respondents, there is a consistent message. So the current conditions in Europe don't allow for fully free and informed choices regarding assisted dying. And there are still major gaps in independent living, including, as mentioned before, the lack of support, but also the general discrimination and social exclusion. So INIL therefore takes a clear position, namely under the current social, economic, and policy conditions, assisted dying cannot be supported as a rights-based option. Also, the stance is important to say is not rooted in ideology, but more in the prevention of human rights violation and the protection of disabled people from pressure, discrimination, and structural neglect. So the primary duty of state is not to facilitate that, but to ensure that every disabled people has the genuine opportunity first to live independently. When it comes to translating this into policy, INIL emphasized that the priority must be to fully realize the right to independent living. This means investing in accessible healthcare and housing and community-based services, including personal assistance. Only once these conditions are met, we can discuss on assisted dying in a truly fair and rights-based context. From this position paper, we also developed some key recommendations. First, fully implement independent living by ensuring access to personal assistance and ending institutionalization. Ensure that all support options are exhausted before considering assisted dying, including healthcare, housing, and social support. Third, protect against human rights violation through strong safeguards, monitoring, and the involvement of disabled people's organization. And introduce mandatory training for medical professionals on disability rights, independent living, supported decision-making, and ableism. And finally, adopt a rights-based approach and cautious approach, recognizing that the differences across countries and prioritizing social investment before any expansion of assisted dying legal frameworks. And thank you so much, and feel free to contact me by email if you have any questions or doubts about the position paper or you want to know more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonella. Okay, let me just bring in the other speakers. So we have 10 minutes for questions, and for sure we have 10 minutes, but I think this topic will, of course, stay relevant for much longer time. It's just sort of the beginning of the conversation for Enel. We have some questions in the chat, and thank you, Peter, for already answering one. So now I would let's start with the people who raised their hands, and then I will also bring in some questions from the chat. Tamara, please go ahead. If you can just be short as possible. Thank you. Just unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, I really will try. I'm sorry. So this is Tamara. I am from EMI International. We are a global organization that represents people with myalgic encephalomyelitis. For those who don't know, we are between 200 and 400 million people affected. 25% of them are severe, very severe, or extremely severe. And of course, assisted dying is part of the question because we are currently very, very underfunded in research. We call our sickness a living death. And we have had many cases of trigger warning, people killing themselves, people being starved in their homes for lack of support, people being killed in psychiatric hospitals because they decide that our sickness is not physical but psychological. And in some countries, we have on daily basis people dying by assisted suicide. So from what I'm hearing, I'm very confused because I think that some of this position against the assisted dying, it's based also on privilege. Like people are not aware of how much suffering people with this specific illness is. And of course, we have everything you have mentioned, like institutionalization, we have lack of support, we have all of that. But my question is, what do we do until we get all that? Like, if we extrapolate it, for example, to the right of having an abortion, like, do we tell people that are pregnant, like, wait until, all women have the rights and you have the rights to have support to be a mother, and until then you have to carry with the pregnancy? Do we have to carry on with our lives suffering until we have all our rights? Or we have to wait to raise 50,000 euros to go to Switzerland to get assisted suicide. So I pray also not to have infantilization of our choices. Many of us, will choose to do this with full conscience.
Thank you. Thank you, Tamara. Now, I think your question or comment is quite clear. I don't know, would somebody like to respond? Miro, Peter, Antonella? Maybe we choose one of, or yeah, if whoever feels like responding.
I can start if that's helpful. Yeah, I think your point raises the kind of complexity around it, and that's why we do have to think deeply about it. I think it comes back to the point of at the end you said people will make this choice in the good conscience if they know what the circumstances are, and that's valid. But we know that there are people who aren't in those situations, and that there are people who will live their life, and they are being denied access to things, and it is those issues that then become more prevalent in their choices. So it's not that we all have a standardized choice of we'll do this because of this reason and we won't do it for this reason. There is such complexity mixed within this, and it goes back to the point of that I think is kind of threaded through all the talk, which is do we as a society want the state to have a role in facilitating this? And my view is that the state's primary role is to support individuals to live a life as best as they can as their needs change over time. And the state is also committed to remove choices from people in order to protect society. This is why none of us can go and sell our organs, because the view is that this is a dangerous act for society, so the state restricts this choice. So it's also a question of is the expectation of the state to facilitate all choice of individual, irrespective of their position, or is it to determine what is the safest conditions that must be enacted in society. And I think that, and this echoes many people who are against assisted suicide, that it is safe not to provide this, because there will be people who will not be making it in the good choices of they absolutely understand the conditions that they're in, and they've decided to still end their life. And Peter talked about examples of this, but there's also people who will be coerced, and there will be people who feel frustrated that because their needs aren't being met, but they could be met, that they will also go down this route as well.
Thank you, Miro. I don't know if Peter or Antonella want to add. No, thank you. Before we go to Elena, there was also a question about people, for example, with intellectual disabilities. I don't know if, and there was a response that in France, indeed, the law allows also people with intellectual disabilities or people in institutions to ask for assisted suicide. I don't know, Peter, if you've come across this question also in your research or in your scoping.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I to be honest, don't know that level of detail. Obviously, there's such a concern that even like sort of that question of is this a coerced choice is absolutely present for everyone in this situation, let alone when you're in situations where you might need some supported decision making, or that like capacity over decision making isn't clear. I would add another issue is then like can one does one administer the drugs oneself, or does one have that administered? I think so different systems have different protocols there, and also relates to capacity of what one can do. Antonella actually shared with me before this webinar an article about a device that you could, I think it was something like you could somehow eye control like the device that that then was what ended your life, so you had agency over that final moment, even if you could, in a situation that you couldn't, say, take a pill yourself. So these are really interesting questions, and I have no answers. No answers for them.
Thank you, Pete. We don't expect you to have like a detail already, but I did. There was a participant from France asked to speak more about the law in France, and I did suggest that perhaps we can organize a follow-up conversation looking, into specific countries in more detail if people are interested, as we will not have time, but we do have a little bit more time. So Elena, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. I made that question, I asked that question, but not related to the possibilities they have to suicide themselves, but to the risk, because people with high support needs, people with complex needs, probably including speech impairments, are in high risk because they are very expensive for the state. And if they cannot clearly speak because they need support to express themselves, they are in a great risk of being considered appropriate for assisted suicide. That is a concern. And the other thing is, I have to thank you because I am not in Europe. I live in South America, and we look at you because you are like a lighthouse for us. And the situation in Europe concerning support is very different from Latin America, I suppose Africa and Asia. So we are still in the step of requiring support. So for us, assisted suicide could be extremely dangerous because we do not have support in place. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. And I think you are overestimating some European countries in terms of access to support. It's very much an issue as well. But thank you for that comment. Now, before we end, I would like to give actually all the speakers just a chance, 1 minute for closing words. And we will look into doing a follow-up. I see there is a lot of interest, so I'm sorry to be running out of time. So in the same order, perhaps we started. Miro, your final words.
Okay, so I mean it's hard to condense to a minute. Yeah, I think Pete and although I'm thinking what my point is, it relates to something that Peter said. Peter said at the end about this question of, if we flipped the question and said it was available to everybody, how would we feel? And I think that is a profoundly important point in this debate, because if your view is that you think it's okay for one group of people or not, and it needs to be a threshold for these people that wouldn't be eligible and so on. The reality is that you have new government cycles, you have new campaign pressures, you have new groups. This is where we've seen in different countries some who will advocate for expansion of different groups. Some will say that the terminal diagnosis is irrelevant. Some will say it's open to children and young people. So really, it does come down to a question of, philosophically, as a society, do we believe it is the absolute right of every individual to have their death facilitated by somebody else? And again, this is an important point, because it's not the choice of the individual choosing to die necessarily. It's the question of, do we want an infrastructure where you can have either state or private enterprise or charity facilitating a mechanism for somebody's life to be ended? And of course, in that, because you're bringing other people into the process, you then have to have questions of accountability and transparency. That's where you get mechanisms of questions being asked, options being given, and so on. And so again, I really think my key point is if you are for this, then really it has to be for everybody. And if that's the position that some people take, then I think that is a more valid point than trying to say that it's only for certain groups over others, because realistically that's won't happen, because you'll get expansion criteria at some point in the future. And the other point, I kind of end with is this what we want from the state? A mechanism to facilitate dignity in death when disabled people do not have dignity in life. And my view is, as I said at the very beginning, is that you have to try to determine, what do you think the role of the state is? And the role of the state, in my view, is it is there to support flourishing of life, support the thriving and the participation of life as best as it can for individuals who will have circumstances that will change. Health needs will change over time, and it is always about prioritizing participation in the best possible way as your needs change over time, as you will need interventions in the future. But that is a very different conversation than the question of, do you have mechanisms embedded and a legal right to allow an individual to say, irrespective of whatever is happening in society, what is being permitted, what is being provided, what is being denied, I still have this absolute right to die.
I forgot to mute myself. Thank you, Miro. Peter?
No, thank you. All this gave a lot of food for thought, gave the subject new life, if you allow me to say. I wanted to close with a suggestion for Enil's next position paper. So Anton, I hope you're ready to go. It struck me we're having like a conversation about assisted dying hosted by a network on independent living, and it raised the question in my mind, like, what is independent dying? What does an independent living perspective on dying in general, not just this question of it, give? And I think that there's really interesting things to explore about palliative care, about hospice support, about choices over continuing treatment or not continuing treatment. Like, what does it mean to have independence at the end of life? I think the independent living movement has such a powerful view on what independence is, and kind of like questions about the end of life get reduced sometimes to these very like explosive topics. But I think it's worth taking a step back, and it's very difficult to consider, and we don't like considering death, but like, if we consider the different dimensions of that, I think that this movement has a really important contribution to make outside also of just this this specific and very challenging question of assisted dying. Thanks all. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Peter, and we take this on board. Thank you. Great suggestion. Antonella, very short final words.
Yes, I will be super short. Thank you also for the suggestion, Peter. And just thank you to all participants for joining, but also for the comments and questions, and to all the speakers. And I really like this meeting and spaces like this where we can have open discussions and raise questions without also feeling the need to have immediate answers, especially on these complex topics. And also for me, drafting this position paper was both very interesting task, also quite challenging. It required to set aside all the personal opinions, and I really learned a lot from the different views. So yeah, that's it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Antonella, and I thank you all again. Apologies for going to Sam and our captioner for going slightly over time. And just as a final thing, something very admin, we will ask you after the webinar to complete a short survey. If you can do that, that would be great. And we acknowledge the support of our EU funding. Thank you all again, and we hope to see you at our next webinar, and please do stay in touch. Feel free to send us an email with any comments or any suggestions. And hopefully you have some sunshine where you are, and we can move on to more kind of light living topics. Enjoy the day. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thanks all. Bye bye.